again. Welcome, everybody. We have 1 minute before we get started. If you'd like to type in the chat box where you're located, that would be useful. But I can hear the thunder out there. It's funny, I said, I'm going to go get mail before it rains. I got in, I was like 5 minutes later, the sky opened.
Oh.
Chattanooga, Tennessee. Are you getting any of these storms that we're getting? Or at least I'm getting in Kentucky. Anybody else want to let us know where you are? That's 3 o'clock. So, oh, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Getting to the close area. Okay, my name's Dr. Jackie Jacob. I am poultry specialist here at the University of Kentucky. And as part of my job, I am the coordinator for the community of practice for small and backyard flocks on E-Extension, Romania, which is the electronic version of the U.S. National Cooperative Extension Service. Our program specifically targets small and backyard flocks. As part of our project, we do monthly webinars. We have been doing monthly webinars for several years now. They are all recorded. Let me make sure he's recording this. Yeah, they are. Sorry, I thought the meeting is being recorded, and the recordings are posted on our Facebook page with the link to, well, they're actually posted on our YouTube channel, with a link to the YouTube page on our Facebook. So today's talk is very interesting. It's going to be Ron Kean from the University of Wisconsin talking about concerns with backyard flocks and some of the implications for public health and whatnot. So are you able to share?
Let's try.
Well, he's getting his PowerPoint up. During his presentation, I will be on mute and I will close down my my video stream. If you have a question, you can either type it in the chat box or type it in the Q&A box. If it is a clarification of something that he is talking about at the time, I will, pop back up and ask the question. Otherwise, we will leave the questions for the end. But if you're like me, if you don't type it in right away, you forget your question. So feel free to type it in. I'm monitoring it to see if it's a clarification or if it can wait until later. So it's all yours.
Is that sharing okay?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. All right, thanks, Jackie. So yeah, Ron Kean, been here for a long time, over 30 years, and I would say one of the things I've worked on a lot over the years is working with different communities and get called in when they want to legalize chickens. I'm not sure. I think most states have had similar things, but a lot of our villages and towns and cities here in Wisconsin have worked on legalizing chickens. Madison, it's been close to 20 years now that they've been legal. They actually doubled the size now, so you can have 8 chickens per household instead of 4. So I would say it's been pretty successful. So I'm going to kind of focus on that with the urban flocks, but most of these things would be true for backyard, even if you're in a rural area as well. But we'll talk about some things. I think it's not going to be too exciting. It's kind of a big long list of things. So, bear with me, but I'll try to add some comments here and there. But again, these are really some things that I think have come up over the years, some concerns, some issues. I'll say too, I'm probably a little bit biased, maybe a lot bit biased. That I do think urban flocks have a place and are good. So, but there are some concerns. So we'll talk about some of those. So really, I would say I've broken this up into sort of three different categories. And I'll go through each one in more detail, but these are sort of some issues that I've seen come up. Concerns that I've seen from people over the years, and some things you should think about, I think, if you are going to have chickens in an urban setting. So the first group, really what I call nuisance related problems. I think these are really true of most people keeping animals. You can run into situations with a lot of these. Really they depend on good flock management. I often try to think about these things with other pets, dogs, cats that are more well known, and you can certainly run into a lot of these problems with dogs or cats as well if you have poor management. So yeah, quite a list here, but again, these I think are a lot of the concerns that people have, and we'll talk about each one in a little more detail. I guess as a general comment, and I think I have this later in the talk, but I'll mention it again. It's really your responsibility as a pet owner, as a chicken owner, to stay ahead of these things and not have these be problems. So hopefully you're all doing that. It doesn't take much more than one bad apple to really cause a lot of problems. So, but again, talk about each of these and some things that you might do to mitigate them. So, first one, and I hear this a lot from a lot of people. I think it's a concern that chickens are going to stink. Okay. And quite honestly, I think if you've got 4 chickens or 6 chickens or 8 chickens, it really should not be a big issue. There shouldn't be a lot of odors involved with them. And generally, again, it kind of goes back to your management. I think if you are having odors, probably something is not really right. And so you want to plan ahead for these things, I think, to avoid this. And really the main issue that causes most of the odors is due to excess moisture and wet conditions. So the litter will have nitrogen in it. We're going to talk about it as a fertilizer later. If it's wet, you can get ammonia, and that's usually where most of the odor comes from. Okay. So really the key to that is don't have excess moisture and excess wet conditions. Probably the biggest place, days like today, when you've got a storm, you've got rain coming in. If you don't have good drainage, you can get into some wet situations and it'll smell in a hurry. When you're building your coop, keep this in mind. Think about drainage, make sure that the water is going to run around the coop and not through the coop, right? Water leaks. If you've got a watering system that is leaking or spilling a lot, you can real quickly get wet conditions. So those are things I would say you want to avoid, okay? Hopefully you're using some sort of litter or bedding, and this should be absorbent so that it can soak up some of that moisture, okay? Again, I would say be prepared, maybe have extra litter and bedding there. So if you do get a water leak, you can change it out and put dry in. So again, pretty common just responsibilities that you should have. The last thing with the moisture is you really do need to ventilate. Okay. Even with a few chickens, they're going to produce some moisture. Their droppings are wet. They will produce moisture. So you're going to need to ventilate a bit to keep that air dry. So odors, again, hopefully shouldn't be a problem. And really, if you do run into odors, you want to find out what's going on and change it. Sort of related to that then is proper waste disposal. And again, you're going to have litter, you're going to have bedding. You need to dispose of that responsibly. In most cases, that's not a problem. I was at a meeting a long time ago and somebody said, well, what do I do with my used litter and bedding? And about 6 people raised their hand. We'll take it. We want it, right? It is great fertilizer for gardens. It's a soil amendment as well. So if you have flowers, garden, things like that, you can use it. I put the compost bin here. It probably works best in many situations to add it to a compost pile or a compost bin. But it really is a valuable product. Okay. I threw this in, not going to spend a lot of time on it, but there has been good research with the value of, in this case, broiler litter, but chicken litter in general, both as a fertilizer and as a soil amendment. One caution I would put in that, if you're using this for vegetable production, food production, you do want to be careful of salmonella or other bacteria, but especially salmonella. And I'm going to mention it later in a different situation, but it is recommended that you put your chicken litter on at least 90 days prior to harvest for above ground crops. So beans, peas, things like that, and 120 days prior for root crops. So radishes, carrots, beets, things like that. So really, you do want to, plan for that and be safe. Another one, and this one's maybe a little more difficult in some situations. What happens when a bird does die? And birds are living, they're going to be dead at some point, right? That's a fact of life. So, first, again, I would say check your local ordinances. I looked up Madison's rules here for an example. They say that burial or incineration off-site are the 2 approved methods that they have for disposal. Other places you may have other options, but those are the 2 that are legal here in Madison as an example. Okay. So another one, and this is probably the second thing I hear usually after odors, is it's going to draw rats and mice. It's going to attract rodents. And there can be some truth to this. I think probably there's already rodents around in many cases. But really the main thing that's going to attract rodents is having feed available for them. So the best way to prevent this is to not have feed available, but you still have to feed your chickens. So it is a little bit of a more difficult thing. Some things I suggest: keeping the feed inside the coop can be helpful. Some people might want to have it outside, but it's probably better from rodents and also from birds that we're going to talk about later on, to have it inside the coop. I really like the idea of hanging feeders. Okay, hang them from a chain from the roof of the coop. That way it's much more difficult for the rodents to get up into the feeder. Um, and so if you have that, and if you have a good lip on the feeder, it's also less likely that the chickens are going to scratch it out and spread it and waste it. Um, so again, I really like the idea of a hanging feeder. Um, Clean up any spills that you see, uh, so that you don't have excess food there. Okay. Your extra feed, maybe you buy a big bag of feed, store the rest in a rodent-proof container. Usually metal containers are better. Um, can have some issues with moisture, but still, usually it's better to have them in a metal container that the rodents can't shoot through. Okay. If you really get into a problem, hopefully you won't, but I have seen situations where you actually had to take the feeder away at night and put it in a container so that the rodents wouldn't get in it. So that's kind of last case, but hopefully you won't run into that. The other thing I would say after feed, the second thing that draws rodents is really nesting areas. Okay. So, you know, keeping the rodents out, not giving them areas, don't have open areas like this that you see in the picture where they can hide and nest back in there. Don't have wood stacked up behind your coop or things stacked up where they can nest in. Um, Hardware cloth over openings is really good just so that you can keep them out. So I think all of those are points to keep rodents away. And finally, again, if you do have a problem, you can do different baits, different traps. There's even organic ones available. So you can use different things like that. Another one that maybe is less of a complaint that I hear, but something you want to certainly think about is the idea of predators. Um, some claim that it will attract predators. Again, I think in most cities, they're probably already there. We have foxes and coyotes and raccoons and possums and all sorts of things here in Madison, and I'm sure most cities do. Um, that being said, they certainly can be a challenge, and you want to avoid them. And again, keeping hardware cloth over windows and vents and things like that so those animals can't get in. Best to keep your chickens confined. Really, I would say all the time, but especially at night in more of a solid facility so that raccoons can't get in, things like that. Raccoons tend to be probably, at least around here, the most common problem that I hear of. Um, they certainly like a chicken dinner, right? So those are some common things. Another one that you might hear from is the idea of noise. Quite honestly, I hear so many barking dogs that I couldn't hear a chicken if it was close to me most of the time. But people don't like to hear that argument. So, but again, I think chickens generally are not real noisy. Most cities don't allow roosters. And so that takes care of a lot of the noise. But hens will occasionally make some noise, squawk or cackle a little bit when they lay an egg in the morning, things like that. Um, Insulating your coop can help to muffle some of that sound. Um, the other thing, and I think this is sort of a last ditch, and you have to be a little careful with this, but if you're really running into a problem, most people, it's the issue of early morning noise that they don't like. Um, and so potentially you might be able to darken your coop to where the chickens are sleeping in the morning, right? And offset their light schedule. That's going to take a little bit of work and a little bit of challenge, but it might work. two things about that, I would say. First of all, again, you still have to have ventilation. You can't seal it up so tight that you're not getting airflow. And keep in mind that to lay eggs, chickens really need long days. And so if you're going to do that, you may have to provide lights in the evening to keep that, 14-hour day or so to keep good egg production. But it might be something to try if you really have an issue with that noise. Birds getting out. Hopefully this isn't a big issue. Most cities, I would say, require that your chickens are confined. I've seen a lot of situations where people don't follow that very closely, but generally you're supposed to keep your chickens confined. So, having a good coop design, having a covered run, this picture I showed here is actually mobile, so you can still move it around the yard if you wanted, but it's confined, right? The other thing I will say is there are some chickens that just don't stay in very well. And quite often you can get breeds that are less flighty, a little more docile, and maybe have less of an issue with that. Some of the lighter, flightier breeds will tend to fly out, even if there's just a little hole in a corner somewhere. So you may want to think about that when you're picking your birds as to if that's going to be a concern. So those are the common, what I'll call nuisance things that I hear about. Again, I think the owner is responsible. You need to plan ahead and think about some of these, what you might have going on. If it's going to be a real wet, rainy period, what can I do to keep it dry, to keep odors down, right? Things like that. And I can't really say this enough. If a problem occurs, do something about it, right? Don't just let it fester, and you'll lose a lot of friends that way in a hurry. So I think those are, again, what I would call some of the more common nuisance concerns that I hear about. Moving on, I think there are some health-related concerns that we should think about, both for the chicken owner and their family and for public health or for neighbors, things like that. And I have three here that I'll mention, and we'll talk a bit about each of them. There's probably some others, but these I think are the most common ones that I hear about. And really, if we can correct or cover for these, we'll probably cover for most of the other potential problems as well. Okay. So the first one, certainly this has been in the news a ton in the last couple of years, and it's definitely a concern, is avian influenza. I have here currently, as of today, and this may change, but I would say currently, avian influenza is probably not a huge concern for neighbors, for people who are not directly associated with the chickens. Maybe get some argument about that, but I think in general, that's the situation we have right now. It's not a huge issue as far as spreading at this point. So hopefully it'll stay that way. But those who actually have the chickens, work with the chickens, there is some concern, definitely for the chickens, and maybe a little bit of concern for the owners themselves. So for the chickens themselves, currently, if they get avian influenza, they're going to die from it, or probably USDA will come in and euthanize them as well. Okay, those that don't die. So that's the situation, at least with the high path that we have going around right now. How do we avoid that? Well, I imagine you've all heard this term biosecurity. If you haven't, it's you will everywhere with chickens. You talk about biosecurity. But the idea is to try to protect your chickens from being exposed to disease agents. Okay. Um, we know that wild birds are carrying this virus right now. And so probably the biggest thing you can do is limit exposure to those wild birds. Um, that may be keeping the wild birds from coming near your chickens. Also, it's keeping people from tracking things between the two. So if you are out, I ride my bike down by the lake and I'm exposed to goose droppings and things like that. I don't want to wear those shoes then around my chickens. Okay, things like that. So there is this transfer that way. I think in general, I'm not going to go into biosecurity a whole lot today. I think we have whole sections on biosecurity or webinars on that. But again, the key point really is not exposing your birds to wild birds, either directly or indirectly. Okay. I guess the other thing I should mention, and we're starting to see more and more mammals potentially getting this virus. So even I talked about wild birds and people, but really exposure to other animals as well should be avoided if you can. So try not to let them be exposed. And then from a human health concern, again, the people who are exposed to the chickens, you should be a little careful. We're going to talk about this a lot more with salmonella and some other bacteria, but exposure to viruses is also a concern. So, wash your hands before and after handling the birds. Change your shoes, things like that we talked about. Just general things that you don't want to expose yourself to this unnecessarily. Dust, I put this in. Again, hopefully it's not a big issue. I think where we run into a little bit of an issue here is I started out the whole talk saying keep things dry, right? And so there is a potential to overshoot that and have dusty litter, dusty bedding. So potentially that can be a concern. Chickens really produce a lot of dust. Um, their feather dander as they're growing new feathers forms of dust. Their feed is dusty. The litter can be dusty. So there is a potential there. So hopefully you've got your building, your coop pretty well contained so it's not blowing too much. I would say to keep the litter levels fairly low. There are people that use deep litter bedding in the winter, so that may be a different situation, but probably in the winter you're going to be closed up more too and have less dust blowing. So, but it's a possible thing. I wouldn't say it's a real common issue. And then really this is one that I want to spend some time on and focus on is salmonella. It seems like every spring the CDC announces that there's another outbreak, and we're seeing this linked to backyard chickens. Um, you know, I can't say this enough. Don't kiss your chickens, right? The way I think about this, and maybe you haven't thought about it, but I don't think very many of us would kiss a processed chicken coming out of the grocery store, right? But in my mind, it's not a whole lot different from the live chickens that they can potentially carry salmonella. So if you wouldn't kiss this one, don't kiss this one, right? And I don't mean kissing either, just little kids, you got to watch out. So it's definitely a concern to be aware of. Many chickens carry salmonella. Okay. It's certainly not an uncommon thing for them to have this. And there's a lot of different types of salmonellas, but some of them can make humans very sick. And so we do want to really watch this. As I said, don't kiss them. Really shouldn't be eating and drinking around the chickens. Okay. That way you can expose yourself to them. I mentioned the dust, they can potentially have droppings and get in that dirt. Really where we see a lot of problems with this are children. If you think about a lot of children, they may suck their thumb, they may lick their fingers, things like that. So you really do want to be careful with them. Supervise them so you know what's going on when they're around the chickens. Wash their hands. Okay. Having hand sanitizer there is not a bad idea, so you can be with that pretty quickly. So I really, again, it is an issue. I would say mostly, again, for the people who are directly with the chickens or around them, and maybe less so from others, but it can spread even after that. One other thing I want to mention, and this is one that comes up and is fairly common, is brooding chicks in the house, especially if you're only going to have 4 or 5 or 6 chicks. It's pretty common that you would try to have them in the house. This picture I have on the bottom left with the little tote, very common way to start chicks, and it works. Again, I would say be careful and think about salmonella. Really make sure you don't have it near the kitchen, near food and drink. If you have a back room or a mud room or something that you can have there, something that's easy to clean, that can be good. I mentioned dust, and this is a place where you will get a lot of dust if you're going to have chicks around. So while I understand it, I'd try to find a place, maybe a garage or something would be a little better to have that if you can. All right, last thing I think I have on salmonella, but again, maybe less of a concern for neighbors. It's probably not going to be a real common issue spreading, but if they're around your chickens, it's something to be concerned about. Keep your chickens confined. We've talked about good biosecurity, so this works 10 for all of them. And I kind of hinted at this, but salmonella isn't the only bacteria that chickens can carry. There are others. We don't think about them as much. We don't hear about them as much, but they can be there. But really the care, the precautions are the same for most of these. So I think if you're doing what you can to prevent salmonella, you're hopefully preventing these others as well. So again, sort of some general comments with the health concerns. There are some risks. I don't want to say there aren't. And again, if you think back to what I said about dogs and cats, there are risks with having dogs and cats as pets as well. So you have to be aware of these, take precautions, supervise children when they're with the pets, things like that. So I think a lot of these are, again, just things to think about anytime you're going to have animals. So that's kind of the health section. And then I want to talk about some things that I've seen and heard over the years with a lot of these. And a lot of these are sort of perception things that you'll run into a lot. And so maybe you want to think about these. One I hear a lot is chickens are farm animals. You shouldn't have them in town. They're farm animals. And while that's maybe true, they can also be really pets, I would say, and especially when you have a small flock of 4 or 6 or whatever. I put this picture of youth at a fair in. You go to one of these chicken shows or one of these fairs and tell me those are farm animals, and I think you'll get some argument. They're really pets in a lot of situations. So, but that's a perception you may hear. This is one I hear a lot, and I think this is a perception of a lot of people. I remember grandpa's farm or grandma's farm, and oh, those chickens were dirty and they stunk, and it was the roosters chased me and it was awful, right? Again, that was a flock in a farm situation. Um, if you talk about somebody with 4 hens in the backyard, it's really quite a different situation. But I think that is a perception that you have to kind of deal with quite often in these situations. I've heard this one, that having chickens is going to lower the property values. I won't say I've dug a lot into this, but I have never seen any evidence that this happened. Certainly from experiences here in Madison, that has not been an issue. In some cases, it probably was a positive to have a chicken coop in the yard when you were selling. But I don't think there's evidence that it's really been a big issue. This is another one you hear a lot, a slippery slope. If we let chickens in, then they're going to want pigs, then they're going to want goats, then they're going to want this, right? And I won't say it's not 100% wrong. I have heard of situations with this, but I think it's something that if you're really concerned about it, you can write in that it's only chickens, right? I've seen probably even closer to that. I've seen people want ducks. And I think that's a really big step to go from chickens to ducks. And so, you can run into that. But it is something that you should be prepared for if you're trying to get this legalized. So just a few other comments, and I'm going to be done early here, but hopefully that's not a problem. But again, I've seen this many cities here in Wisconsin, and I think in many other states, have allowed chickens. As I said, here in Madison, it's been close to 20 years now, I think, and they really have not had many problems. One of the things I think that I've seen over the years, even though it's allowed, there's only going to be a few people that actually have chickens. I was involved with a city probably 15 years ago. I'm going to say there's 40 or 50,000 people in the town, and they argued, and I went and talked, and they had all this discussion about allowing chickens. And a year later, after they legalized it, I think there were 4 families that had chickens. Okay. So it's not like every house on the block is going to have chickens. So, but that's something to think about. Some other things, again, the rules can be as specific as the municipality wants to be. I've seen some that have very specific conditions. I've seen some that have how much window space you have to have in your coop. I've seen a lot of them will have different floor spaces per bird. I was just to a town the other day. They had a minimum of coop space per bird and a minimum of run space per bird. Okay. Rules like that. I've seen some that have minimum and maximum temperatures that are allowed, so you have to plan ahead for that and deal with it. So different things there. And most of these, if you have them, they can help with some of those management issues that I talked about earlier. Some require education. I've seen this where if in order to get your permit, you had to show that you had taken a class or watched videos or something to have that. Now that requires some background on the other side to have something available, but that might be something to consider. Many municipalities will have a license or a fee. Again, I kind of try to tie this back to a dog license or a cat license, right? Should be a similar thing. It's a pet. So there are some of those involved. And then I don't know, this will vary by state. In Wisconsin, we have a state rule that every person that has chickens is to register their premise. The idea of this is that if there's a disease, the Department of Agriculture will know where these chickens are. It's something I highly suggest, even if your state doesn't require it. Most of them will have this available. You'll get information then if there is a disease outbreak. A concern that often comes up is, are they going to come out and kill my chickens? And I can say, at least here in Wisconsin, that is not the case. They are very good about that. They'll probably come out and test them. In our case, we've had influenza outbreaks. They will come out and test your birds. And if they're positive, then yes, they will. But if they're negative, then you'll be fine. And so I do think it's a positive thing, and it's something you should consider. Couple other things here. And this is always one that's going to be a challenge. I think 95% at least of the municipalities I've worked with do not allow roosters, okay? The problem comes in that even if you buy sexed chicks that are pullets, there's probably going to be about a 5% error rate, which means about 1 in 20 is going to be a rooster probably. So there's going to be some roosters. If you buy chicks from breeders where they don't have sexing available, then it's an even higher percentage. But it is something you want to plan ahead and have a plan for. And I will say one of the best situations I've seen has been in this area. There are Facebook groups, there are internet groups that include people outside of the city, and some of them are willing to take your roosters and deal with them. Okay. Also, a lot of the breeders that I've seen working with small groups like this, they'll have a system set up that they'll take your rooster back and maybe trade you for a hen, things like that. Again, it's just something you need to plan for and really have an idea what to do ahead of time, because there are going to be some roosters occasionally. The other thing is sort of on the other end of it, if you will. What do you do with old hens? Some of them may live, 5, 6, 7, 8 years. They're probably not going to be laying a lot of eggs by that time. And so you kind of have to make a decision. Are you in this for egg production, or are they pets? And I would say if they are pets, then fine, you keep them just like you did, an old cat or old dog that's being around. If you're wanting them for the egg production, again, you may want to have some plan, and that may be talking to someone outside of the city, things like that to find a place for them. Another situation that I think you want to plan ahead for and really look into this, and this is a huge challenge that I see. There are very, very few veterinarians that see chickens. And if you're going to have chickens at some point, you're probably going to have a sick chicken. Um, so you do need to plan ahead for that and think about it. Try to find a vet that will see them. Um, it's a huge challenge, but we do have a few here that they may consider them exotic animals, but they will see them. So that's something I would suggest you look at ahead of time and plan for. Um, this is really something, and I think this is my last slide, but I think as far as people who are trying to legalize this in their municipality, something I've seen over the years is it's really helpful if you can find someone that's sort of in the system to help and champion this cause. There are a lot of committees, a lot of things you have to work through to get these through. And so my experience has been if you can find someone that's helpful and really for your case, then that can make it much easier to move through. So covered a lot of things. Again, I'm a little bit biased. I think, I do think it's a good thing. So I think there are a lot of positives, but hopefully that gives you some thought and some things to think through.
Okay, we have one question from Pam Watson. She says, have cities been open to backyard duck flocks, more or less of an issue than chickens? And do most cities list chickens specifically or poultry in general as acceptable?
Most list chickens specifically. I do know of one city fairly close here, actually in Iowa, that legalized ducks. I don't know how that's gone. That's been quite a few years ago, and I think it's still the case. One of the big issues I would say is that in ducks, the female species are loud and the male, or not species, the female sex is loud and the males tend to be the quiet ones. And so not too many people want to keep a bunch of drakes around. They're not going to lay eggs and they're not going to for you, but that can be an issue with the noise. Certainly the wetness, the risk of odor is a lot higher there as well. So I think it's pretty rare that ducks have been allowed.
Lexington actually allows ducks, but very
Okay.
few people want ducks because of the high moisture content of the fecal
Yeah.
material. I think it's fair to say that there are as many different rules as there are cities with them. I mean, I've never seen two ordinances the same.
Very
And,
true.
even here in Kentucky, it depends on which definition of poultry they use in their city's ordinances, because our state laws have two definitions. One has poultry has to be raised for profit in order to be poultry. If it's not raised for profit, then it's not poultry,
Hmm.
which makes no sense. But um, yeah, your state rules. Um, yeah. Is there an
Yeah.
ideal set of regulations that we could look at as a good example for cities?
As you mentioned, there's so many different ones. I would say, at least around here, Madison has been kind of a template for a lot of people, and they have it posted on their Madison website. I can find that, but
Which Madison website?
the city of Madison.
Okay.
There's actually a Mad City Chickens website too. It doesn't get many updates, but it's I believe it has the ordinance there as well. As I said, they upgraded it from 4 to 8, and I don't know if the Mad City Chicken ones has changed that or not. But
It says 4 on there.
yeah, that was just about a year ago that they raised it to 8. So, and I don't think the Mad City Chicken's website gets updated very often.
Yeah, I think a lot of it depends on what you're defining as backyard.
Yeah,
Some backyards are relatively large and can take more, and then the state rules come into play with the house has to be so many feet from the road, so many feet from a water source, so many feet
yeah,
from a church or a school.
yeah. A lot of them also are zoned different things. And so, yeah, you mentioned, how big your yard. I've seen some where if you have more than an acre, then you're allowed this, that there's a lot of variation. So it's really hard to narrow it down to one specific one.
And Lexington here has a tour de coops every year. They started it up again this year with COVID being over. And the tour, when you go from place to place, which is a biosecurity nightmare, during the day of tours, the size of yards is, and this is all within the city limits of Lexington, to a very tiny backyard to this huge backyard. So
Yeah.
it's hard to have regulations that cover everything. And then Pam's like, we have some families who have members that are allergic to chicken eggs but can eat duck eggs and have asked about ducks. As I said, the manure handle is the main issue.
Yeah, it's really difficult to keep it dry, and then again you end up with odor problems.
But I know a lot of people who can eat duck eggs but not chicken eggs.
Yeah,
And they're hard to find.
And expensive generally.
And they go rotten really fast.
True.
Because they haven't been handled properly.
Right, yeah. So.
Which is, sad that people will sell eggs that are not properly handled, which is technically against the law, but
yeah.
Since when did that matter, right? Anybody else got any questions? I think he covered some of the main issues that we see here as well. And that, from both sides, because there's a lot of people who complain. I know that there's a few people in my neighborhood who have chickens, and I have occasionally heard a rooster. Never actually seen it, but and I've never heard it in the morning. It's always like during the day sometime. Will you do a webinar about selling chicken eggs at market? That is a state by state variation, different egg laws. Can you wash, not wash, refrigerate, not refrigerate? That's very state to state. Kentucky is Kentucky. We did have one. If you email me, I will send you the link to the one we did a few years ago on marketing different products specifically in Kentucky. We did it during COVID.
Yeah. Just thinking too with Madison, they actually, and you were talking about the yard size, they actually have it open to duplexes, and I believe up to quadplexes can even have. So again, there's variation. I've seen a lot, but they did open to that. And I think you also get into, and I don't know the specifics there, but you may have to get approval from your other neighbors, and that's another one I should have mentioned, but sometimes that's in there.
Yeah, that can be in some of the rules. I've seen that.
Yeah,
Yeah. And then you have the problem that you get the chickens, you know, after having all your neighbors, and then one of your neighbors moves out and somebody else buys the place, and
yeah,
they object. You know, and it's like,
yeah,
well, you were there first, but
right. Yeah,
uh, then
yeah.
fights get started. But I did know that Florida, one of our speakers that comes on a lot, she teaches an online course in Florida specific for Floridians who need to take the course in order to be able to
Okay.
keep chickens. So there are some that require the education.
Yeah,
We don't here in Kentucky. And you know, the registering, we don't require that, and nobody knows where they are. And a lot of times, because even though the city ordinances allow it, homeowners associations
yeah,
typically don't,
right.
because they say it affects the property value. And so our homeowners association here has no committee, no care. We don't have any rules. But if you go 2 blocks down,
Yeah,
their homeowner association doesn't allow you to have a shed in your backyard for your lawn equipment, doesn't allow you to have poultry of any kind, you know.
yeah,
So homeowners associations can trump anything that you want to have in your city ordinances. So, and I have heard of ordinances where you can have rooster visitations.
mm,
So if you're a breeder, you can keep females and then once a year or whatever, bring a rooster to visit, um, to get fertile eggs to hatch out. I have seen regulations do that. So
that's a new one. I had not
that's a
heard of
new
that.
one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I love how sit there and say you can't have roosters because of the noise, but we are here, trains, airplanes, and sirens all day here. Usually it's the morning thing, but
For me, it's barking dogs that I
oh
just
yeah,
all over.
I
But
have
yeah,
a dog, so you know, but she rarely barks. I mean, you haven't heard her bark at all. So,
no,
um, but yeah, the whole city thing. And
yeah.
okay, so I hope I see you guys next month. I think I'm on the schedule next month. Let me check the webinars for Food for Chickens is July 2nd. I think that's me. Yep. Um, Talking about options for feeding your backyard flock, including complete rations, fermentation, using concentrates and your own grains, and pasturing, and what not to feed your chickens. So should be an interesting presentation when I get it together. Hopefully I'll see you guys then. So thank you very much, Ron. As usual, you did a great job. Appreciate it. You always come to my, to my help.
All right.
Thank you, guys.